Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 113. Today's guest is Matthew Salises. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today on the show, I'm talking with writer Matthew Salises. Matthew Salises is the best-selling author of The 100-Year Flood, an Amazon Best Book of September and Kindle First Pick, an Adoptive Family's Best Book of 2015, and a Best Book of the Season at BuzzFeed, Refinery29, and Gawker, among others, and Disappear, Doppelgänger Disappear, a Best Book of the Year at Thrillist.com, and Most Anticipated Book at The Millions. Forthcoming in 2021 are a craft book, Craft in the Real World, and a collection of essays, Own Story, published by Little A. His previous books include I'm Not Saying, I'm Just Saying, Different Racisms on Stereotypes, the Individual, and Asian American Masculinity, and The Last Repatriate. Matthew was adopted from Korea. In 2015, BuzzFeed named him one of 32 essential Asian American writers. His essays have been published in Best American Essays 2020, NPR Code Switch, The New York Times Motherlode, Vice.com, Gay Magazine, and many other venues. His short fiction has appeared in Glimmer Train, American Short Fiction, Pen Guernica, and Witness, among others. He has received awards and fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Glimmer Train, Mid-American Review, Pank, HTML Giant, Impact, Imprint, and elsewhere. I had the opportunity to read Matthew's new book, Disappear, Doppelgänger Disappear, recently, and it's a book that I keep coming back to and thinking about. It's smart, it's strange, it's funny at the most unexpected times. Writer Matt Johnson called it a brilliant existential detective story in which the mystery is the truth of oneself, disturbing in the best way. And that matches my experience of it. At the beginning of the story, the narrator, a Korean-American man named Matt Kim, says that he feels like he's disappearing, and that turns out to be literal. He discovers a sort of parallel world where his double, his doppelganger, looks exactly like him, but is smarter and more successful and just generally seems to be better than him in every way, only that doppelganger has also disappeared. It's a weird, fantastic, unsettling story that is ultimately about trying to exist in a world that seems to want to erase you. Like I said, I thought about this book a lot after reading it, so I was really excited to get the chance to talk to Matthew about it. Now, if you're listening to this episode on the day it releases, the book has just been published this week, and Matthew has several virtual events coming up. On August 20th, 2020, Matthew will be in conversation with Laura Vandenberg via Thank You Books. On August 27th, 2020, he'll be doing a reading with Liz Lenz via Prairie Lights. And on September 14th, 2020, he'll be in conversation with Margot Livesey via Belmont Books. There are links to all of those events and store websites in the show notes, so do check those out. Finally, I've put a bookshop.org link in the show notes to where you can buy a copy of Disappear, Doppelgänger Disappear, or you can buy it from your local independent bookstore. If you do that, and if you like it, I highly encourage you to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads. That really helps boost the book's sales, and I've put links in the show notes to where you can do that. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Matthew Salises. I think I finished reading the book for the first time maybe a month or 2 months ago, and it's been on my mind ever since. It's sort of stayed with me more than most books that I read, even books that I read for the show. It's been something that I've been sort of turning over a lot in my mind. And so I'm really excited to sort of dig into it with you.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, that's ideal.
Yeah. I feel like it's a book that doesn't necessarily give up what is going on real quickly. And I think that's what makes it so interesting and why I've sort of stuck on it so much. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because, I came to this book without really knowing anything about it, other than the title. And there is this, and you've talked about this in other interviews, a sort of surreal quality to it. But one of the things that I was thinking about is how not knowing what kind of a story it will be beforehand, right? Like if you come into a story knowing that this is science fiction or this is sort of contemporary realism or this is fantasy, YA fantasy, right? Then that sort of sets up an expectation for the reader of how the book is going to go.
Right.
And with this book, I didn't really have that. So like having the book be, I'm not sure if the right term is surreal or sort of fabulist or fantastic or maybe magic realist, although I gather that's sort of a problematic term sometimes. How this sort of works against the reader expectations, you know, it made it a little, not knowing really what is going on beforehand, what to expect, made it a really interesting experience to watch how the book unfolds. And so I wanted to sort of talk to you a little bit about that. Does that?
That sounds great. Yeah. I mean, I kind of run into this problem sometimes where the world is so confusing, right? And when I'm trying to write about it, it can be difficult to make the book not confusing when you're trying to write about how confusing the world is. So I kind of like the idea that there's not like that steady ground to stand on, although I think some readers definitely do not like that in literature in general. But it seems a lot more like the world that I live in, you know, just as an adoptee and Asian American and, you know, widower and so on and so forth. So there's this quote that I like from Julio Cortázar that maybe it's not a quote, but I'm just going to sum it up, that he says about when he's asked about magical realism, he says, "Oh, I'm just writing realism. You know, like the world is much weirder than this. And so this is the way the world is, or this is one way the world is." And I think of it like that, I guess, that I'm trying to write about, I guess, two ways that the world is, maybe, since there's the kind of doppelganger dimension of it. But for a while, I was trying to think about how to kind of breach the gap between Matt's reality and our reality. But I think in some ways, it's nicer to have this sense that what's happening is this kind of weird blurring between those two realities. And, you know, in the book, kind of language is one of the ways that Matt is both able to kind of navigate and also not really navigate it, but it's kind of a big like wall between the two worlds.
I think, you know, when I first started reading this, when I first got the ARC of it, I was reading it before we entered the lockdown. And there is this, I think, more and more as we've progressed through this pandemic, the world just seems to get weirder and weirder. And I reread the book a couple of days ago, and coming back to it for a second time, there was this way in which this sort of strangeness and unfamiliarity of it, that sort of feeling of not necessarily having a solid ground, did feel more like real life in a lot of ways. Like so many ways that the world has sort of pulled the rug out from under us, whether that's in these big global kind of ways or in more personal ways. It is unsettling. And so reading that the second time felt much more familiar than it did the first time. And I found that a really interesting experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I've had that experience too. I just, I was talking to my editor a little while ago about writing essays to help promote the book. And I was saying to her, I don't know how to write essays anymore because I don't know what reality is anymore. You know, it's hard to write an essay about the world when you kind of can't place what the construct is that you're writing about, right? Because it's all kind of a constructed illusion. But we're kind of in between one illusion and another. And oddly, like that's a more like real unreality. And we're kind of trying to exist in this place where we're trying to figure out what the next normal or whatever construct will look like. But it's hard to do.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about, especially the second time reading through the book, is there are a lot of references to this, you know, unnamed KKK promoted presidential figure. And, you know, so, I mean, it's clear what the reference is here, but
I thought I obscured it enough.
but the thing that's interesting to me, right, is that you, I think in the afterword of the book, you say that the book took you like 7 years to write. Is that right?
Right.
So when you started writing this book, I mean, he was on the sort of political scene in some ways, but certainly not as a candidate and not to the extent that he is now.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about that a little bit, about if I were to imagine reading this book 7 years ago, this figure would have seemed completely ridiculous, like it would have seemed like a fantasy in some way, but of course now it feels just spot on to what we're living. And I was sort of interested because you started reading or writing this book before that stuff happened, like how that came into the story and how, like, for you, what the decision was to start incorporating that into the story.
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember kind of right after the election results that a lot of people felt like they couldn't write. And I think maybe it's a kind of similar situation that there's a kind of paradigm shift, or at least for some people, there's a kind of paradigm shift where they realize something about the world that they either didn't want to realize or just hadn't realized. And the kind of reality that was always there became much more in the forefront. I was talking to this friend a little while ago, and he reminded me that I had told him 7 or 8 months before that Trump was definitely going to win the election. But by the time that it came around, I was like reading the Nate Silver things, and I was like, oh, well, Nate Silver, it's got to be right? And I'd almost convinced myself that it wasn't going to happen. And so it was still like surprisingly or like unsurprisingly or surprisingly unsurprising. I'm not sure. But I had to go into class. I was teaching at the University of Houston and talked to my students about this. And, some of them were kind of quietly celebrant and some were really crushed, right? I was thinking too about my daughter, who at one time I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if she had grown up with like a black president and then a woman president, like the first of their kinds, but that's all that she would have known, right? And a lot of the students, because they're so young, they really had been living in this kind of like Obama bubble, and it was just crushing to them to see that this world was the way it was. And there's a lot of talk amongst, people I was, talking with, I guess, about how to teach in the climate directly afterward and kind of what we should do about teaching fiction. And some people were kind of reassessing why they were actually teaching fiction. And I was doing that too. And I was thinking about my classes and what we're doing in class, right? When we're talking about stories, and it just all seems, right? I always am thinking all of this is storytelling. And we let kind of one story about who we were dominate or at least obscure another story that was always there and really powerful, that we didn't really want to acknowledge, or some of us didn't want to. And I was writing this novel and I was thinking, this is the world, right? Like, and if I'm writing about this person in this world and what they're dealing with kind of in a world politically charged and run by a system of power that works against him, then this is part of that world, right? And I've got to kind of write it in. And I also felt, so I was writing that into the book, and then I was thinking, because I had said it, of course, before the election, and it started with an earthquake that actually happened to me when I was in Boston, and it was just very strange to have an earthquake in Boston. And so I had started with that idea, and the idea of kind of an earthquake unsettling reality. And I kind of wanted it to be an unsettling reality or a transitional reality. And so I didn't want to set it after the election, but I kind of was able to have my cake and eat it too in the book, right? So I was trying to kind of work in the ways that this story was always there and really influential, and that people were, living in it, promoting it, or kind of denying it, even as it was kind of growing and like a kind of monster, something that like eats and eats and eats and grows bigger and bigger. I have no idea whether that answered the question or not. I've actually.
No, it's good. It's interesting how it's in the background, right, of the story. It's not like the story isn't really focused on that. It's part of the setting, but there's this sort of consistent menacing quality to the world throughout this story. And I think a lot of people, when you approach a story as a reader, or even if you're just talking about the story of the real world that you tell yourself, like you were talking about, many people want to have a certain sense of comfort with a story, right? And that sense of sort of background menace that is running through, manifested in one way by the presence of this candidate, it does sort of take that comfort away. I found that really an interesting experience as a reader. And it seemed like, that must be an intentional thing. So, hearing you talk about that is, it does answer the question for me.
I find the world very menacing. I actually, since we've been staying at home since March, my kids and I have basically not seen another human being except for people who help deliver the groceries and stuff since March. And in some ways, it feels safer just because for some people, I think the world was more menacing because of other people than it was because of like the virus or circumstantial things, even though those things are also kind of made worse by the systems that we live in and inequalities that are already there. And I'm lucky to kind of have a certain amount of privilege that allows me to stay out of it. But the world has always been pretty menacing to me, I guess, to sum it up. The world is scary. And I never took a lot of comfort I never really wanted comfort in books, I guess. I want comfort from like K-drama.
Yeah.
Turn to other things for comfort.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned K-drama because K-dramas come up in the book a lot. And I thought that was interesting in a number of ways, but sort of widen a little bit instead of focusing in on that one thing. One of the things that I was thinking about is, so you've been writing a column for Catapult about Asian American literature. And in one of them, you mentioned that this book is the most Asian American thing you've ever written. That was also a column I read after I'd already finished reading the book, and then coming back to it again with that in mind also changed the experience of reading the book for me, which is interesting too, because, I'm also Asian American, and it wasn't something that had necessarily occurred to me so much the first time, but reading the book the second time with that in mind, it became much more obvious. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that, about how this is for you an Asian American novel.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking of audience, which I have kind of thought and written a lot about in the last, 4 or 5 years, maybe. And a lot of that came about from writing the first draft of the novel so long ago. And at the time thinking, well, crap, my last novel wasn't selling. And I thought maybe I should just write like a murder mystery or something. And so actually the original title was called The Murder of the Doppelgänger. And I had written the draft kind of just by deciding that at every opportunity for something to happen, I would write exactly the thing that I thought was the least expected thing to happen. But I ended up with just a bunch of things disappearing and then later some of those things reappearing, which, I guess tells you something about how my mind works. But as I was kind of re-examining the book and thinking about what these disappearances meant, and thinking about the kind of murder mystery quality of it, I was also thinking about the kind of murder murder mystery things and the ways that the detective story plays into that kind of fiction, and that the detective story is always read like a story about the self, a search for the self. And so when I thought, like, if you're taking that, and something I've always wanted to do is like take that story and actually put it like in an Asian American context, and then also like with like not so offensively written women characters. It just becomes a really interesting shift, right? Because he's writing about this dislocation from a societally accepted reality. And I think that's a pretty common reality that Asian Americans live in. And so what if that becomes like the kind of normal state rather than, as it is in Murakami, it's like this one guy seems totally different from everybody else, and everybody else is like, what are you, like, what world are you living in? But here it's like that dislocation is so many people's experiences. And so I started to think about, if this is a murder mystery, which it, kind of is, whatever, detective story, then who's the person who gets murdered, right? And who's the murderer? And in the story, I was thinking a lot about the model minority myth and how we kind of kill off a person ourselves, right? We kill off a version of ourselves to become a more acceptable version of ourselves. And what happens to the murdered or disappeared person in that situation? And what happens to you as the person who, if you kind of bought into this myth, has become a kind of disappearer? What's the kind of journey of the self, and what's the mystery? And so I was kind of trying to think about it in that way, as a story about the model minority myth and what we can do as Asian Americans. And then, as I was writing that, a lot of stuff happened in my life, a lot of trauma and stuff happened in my life. And I had a really amazing experience of teaching at the Kundiman retreat and being around all these other Asian American writers and reading the work there and hearing other people read their work to this audience that we, very rarely ever have, just kind of other very liberal, super liberal Asian American people who read a lot of books, right? Mm. And that's what I felt like I actually had my ideal audience, right? Like that, and maybe for the first time or only time in my life that it was like real people sitting in front of me. And I thought, like, what am I doing with this book if I'm not writing it for this audience? And what do I want a book to do if I am writing it for this audience? And so that helped guide me through a lot of revisions. I mean, I revised a lot. So the book, that's part of why the book had none of the specific menace that it does now. It had different menace. It just changes a lot over time. And it became, for me, a more and more Asian American project in my mind as I went.
It's interesting, hearing the comparison to Murakami, which hadn't occurred to me, but in hearing you say it makes perfect sense to me. But of course, and this is pretty much what you said, that, Murakami is writing as an Asian person in Asia,
right? Which
is a fairly different context from an Asian person in America. And so hearing you talk about that distinction, I mean, it's so interesting too, because when you talk about, audience and talk about, who are you writing for, that I think that is a distinction that is lost on a lot of white American readers, but of course is not at all lost on an Asian American reader.
Yeah.
One of the things that another thing that you wrote about in that Catapult column that I found really interesting and also sort of unlocked a bit about the book in a number of ways to me was you writing about David Eng and Shinhee Han's split subject concept.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so here you describe this as, referring to the model minority myth, that in order to exist in a reality in which racism is non-existent, must deny his raced experience. And in particular, how they wrote about, you have to deny the racism because otherwise you would have to admit that you aspire to live in a racist system. And that was right. This way that this sort of denial of the actual reality, it seems to, and this sort of two-ness implied by a split like that, it seems to inform a lot of the book in sort of bigger plot ways, but also especially in the character of Matt Kim, the narrator. And having that framing, for coming back to the book the second time with that in mind, it was really interesting. And also really, there were things about the book in the second reading that opened up and felt familiar to me in a way that I sort of missed the first time. And so that concept just really, I don't know, it did a lot for me, both in terms of understanding the book, but also in terms of understanding certain things about my own experience of life. So I know that's not a question, but.
No, thank you for saying it though. That, obviously makes me feel really pleased.
I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is, we've sort of referred a little bit to how the character Matt is sort of an unusual character, how other people see him as sort of unusual. And this distinction between how he sees himself and how other people in the book see him, it drives a lot of the tension of the book. And it seems to me that split subject plays very directly into that characterization, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In thinking about disappearing and invisibility and visibility, sometimes I think like we pushed cultural representation to a point where it seems as if visibility is like the end goal, though I'm sure we don't actually think of it that way, but sometimes it can seem as if visibility has become this kind of magical key to unlocking things. And I think all the time about, right, like how there's so many ways in which we feel hypervisible in a way that's really just an invisibility. And even the ways that we see ourselves that are a way of seeing ourselves, but also are kind of a way of erasing ourselves. And so I was trying to write about that. I mean, I think of those columns actually. The first one especially is like a crib notes for the book. I kind of wanted to like include it in the book in some way, but it wasn't really flying with my publisher. So I think it's too academic or something. But I don't know if I'll ever be able to write a book that's not really about like melancholy. And I think melancholy is so applicable to this state of kind of racial disassociation that we have to live in some ways in order to survive a country that wants to erase us.
It's interesting to me too, a lot of the murder mystery sort of aspect of it is sort of the broad structure, I guess, of the book. But most of what ends up actually happening from moment to moment are these very sort of awkward interactions that Matt ends up having with everybody else in his life. And
it's a good way of describing it, yes.
Well, I mean, a lot of times it seems like he and the people that he's talking to are not even having the same interaction, like they're not in the same conversation in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's interesting to me about this is the first person perspective. And I think this was something that you wrote about in one of your craft essays about how the first person perspective sort of sets a certain expectation about reliability or unreliability. But it also does a thing where it sort of privileges that point of view because it's so much closer and more interior.
Right.
But when we see him from the perspective of the people that are talking to him, whether that's his daughter or his ex-wife or his ex-girlfriend or his ex-girlfriend's doppelganger or, any of these people, or his employees at one point, what they like, he doesn't really see things from their perspective. And what it struck me was this, coming back to the split subject, is sort of denying that side of things. Like if he were to be able to see that direction, that perspective, then he would have to admit the ways that some of the things that he's done are, put generously, questionable. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, and how the first person perspective really sort of amplifies that. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I really like the way you're saying that. And it makes me think of some books in which we're like the way that you're trapped within the first person perspective plays a kind of a large role in the purpose of the book. And like I thought a lot about it with The Vegetarian, for example, with the way that book opens and you're kind of stuck in this really terrible person's head. And the book itself kind of asks you, or kind of demands really, that you resist the seduction and the kind of trap of the first person, right? That in order to read that book with any kind of love, you have to resist the totally unloving narrator in the first section. And then by the time you get to the second section, you're like, thank God this is over, right? And then I'm kind of free of this person's head. And at first it seems like, oh, well, this guy's like an artist. He seems like way better. And then you find yourself kind of duped, or not duped, but like, right, you've kind of given this guy too much credit, and now you're trapped in this other really terrible person's head. And then you get to the third part and you're like, oh no, what's going to happen? And it's her sister who loves her, like clearly loves her and is trying to do her best, but like the trauma is so kind of built up by then that there's no way to not live in it. And so the sister even has to end up doing these things to the vegetarian that you really don't want to happen. And so each level is like you're getting kind of closer or slightly closer to something that is more sympathetic or whatever. And each time you have to resist it more and more. And I think in some ways that's a book that kind of lays on the table what it's doing and kind of aims everything towards a purpose in a way that a lot of books do not, especially Western novels. And then I was thinking too of like when I was in graduate school, my thesis advisor wrote a novel in 4 parts, 4 novellas, I guess you would say. Her name is Margot Livesey, and the class is called The House on Fortune Street, and it's a great book. 3 of the sections are in third person and 1 is in first person. And she said, I think in class, or maybe at a reading or something, that she had chosen first person for that perspective because it was the person who was the least sympathetic and kind of the easiest to check out of. And so by trapping you in the first person, you at least have to kind of, there's a forced empathy there. And I think that's really interesting. And I really like first person books for some reason. Maybe because of this, that I love not really great first person narrators. Recently, I was thinking about the Olga Tokarczuk book. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead or something, in which you're trapped in a murderer's perspective. There's a way in which I just wrote an essay about this, but there's a way in which maybe we kind of put too much value on empathy, I think, or a certain kind of empathy that's really about the self and not really about the other. And the first person can be a way sometimes of making you examine that, right? That when you're in first person, you're not really seeing the narrator. You're kind of seeing it like through your eyes and the narrator's eyes, and you're kind of collapsing those two in a weird way that says a lot to me about how we learn to think of people as people. And so often it's through the self, and it seems kind of dangerous to me. And so I really appreciate books that that push back on that in a way, and that force you to think of even the narrator, even a first person narrator, as another, right? And to appreciate them as another rather than trying to make a connection between you in order to understand them or like reading about them.
Yeah, I guess that sort of reminds me too about the whole question of likability in characters, and which, is of course mostly a criticism of female characters.
Yes.
But then, it's such a reductive thing to say, like, is this character likable or not? Rather, what seems important is rather not whether they're likable, but rather whether their likability or unlikability, what is that functioning in the story?
Right.
And the narrator in this story, like, I feel like you have a lot of opportunity to change your mind about him throughout the story. If that makes sense.
He's not so clear cut.
No, not at all. So we're coming up on the halfway mark, but there was one other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about. I'm not entirely sure where this is going to go, but I want to see where we get. And it's because it comes up in the book over and over again, is this concept or even like phrase of taking responsibility.
Right.
It comes back over and over again, and it comes up in the context of K-dramas. It comes up he has this certain intention of taking responsibility, but it's not always clear what that means even to himself.
Yes.
But it seems like, especially because it comes back so many times, that this idea of taking responsibility is sort of a central part of the book, or at least that's how it came across to me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think taking responsibility is one of my favorite things about K-dramas. The way that they'll say, right, like, I'm in love with you and you need to take responsibility for that, right? Like, it's not all on me. You've done these things that showed me that or like at least led me on to think that you care about me, and you have to take responsibility for what you've done, right? And you have to take responsibility for somebody else's feelings, even if you can't really like pin them down on you caused me to love you. We have to I think we have to do more of taking responsibility for others' feelings and for our own feelings. And Matt, as you said, the narrator of the book, as you said before, has done, or maybe like not done in a way that is doing really sometimes questionable things. And what he hasn't done is take responsibility, pretty much across the board, you might think. And it's not that he doesn't want to, but he doesn't really know how. You're right. He doesn't really know how to do so. And he hasn't made himself think and self-examine and in a way that would be the start of taking responsibility. And so as the book is going, he's turning that question over and over in his head, and the question of like what it means to be a human being, or in his words, a homo sapien, which is a joke, and like what it means to be a person in a society of people, especially when that society of people is not is not totally likable and also doesn't kind of treat you as likable. Can you take responsibility for somebody else's erasure of you? Can you take responsibility for the part you play in that? Can you take responsibility for not doing things as much as for doing things? And I think taking responsibility kind of came in later in the editing process. And as it came in more, I started to think of it as a really nice way of, also maybe because I'm a parent and my kids, I'm always trying to get them to actually take responsibility for things as a nice way of seeing kind of your place in the world, right? Like you have a responsibility in the world. And the world often is kind of shirking its responsibility to you, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility. And if you can kind of figure out what that is, maybe you can live kind of a more human or more loving life. I mean, I think taking responsibility has a lot to do with love, actually. And in the similar way to what we were talking about with the first person narrator, you have to kind of take responsibility even for the ways that you see other people as versions of you, or the way that empathy kind of drives the connection of what makes somebody human. I think in some ways taking responsibility means taking responsibility for the primacy of the self in that situation and many other situations, and also like recognizing the otherness of the other, right? Like that these are people with their own desires and their own lives, and that it should resist this kind of you are like me and that's why you're human, or that's why you matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I just, it was something, the way that the story keeps coming back to that, and the way that he is constantly thinking about taking responsibility and then not doing it. It was just such an interesting thing. And this gap, and this comes up a lot too, this gap between what his intention is and then what he actually does. Is just so fascinating. And it was interesting because at the first reading, I just felt like, God, this guy is so weird. But there's this, like, there are things that he does that are kind of off-putting, but in the second reading, like, there are points when he describes things that he's doing as though he has no control over them and as though he's watching them from outside of himself. Yeah. And that, like, the first time I read that feels like, well, is this like a magical moment? Is something but then, like, thinking about it again in the second reading, there is a familiarity to that. Like, there are moments in your life where you're like, oh no, don't say that. And then you do say it.
Right.
So yeah.
So much of what you do is contextual, right?
Yeah.
Like there's this study where on memory loss and amnesia, and where the doctor goes in and I can't remember where this is from, and then introduces himself to the patient, and the patient says some regular phrases, and 5 minutes later it has to happen again. But the thing is, like, the patient says exactly the same thing. Right. And 5 minutes later, the patient says exactly the same thing in exactly the same words. It's not a choice, really. This is the context. And in that, your brain has certain ways of filling that space. And there's, the large thread in the book, especially from Sandra and Yumi's conversations, is about fate and free will. And I was maybe reading too much stuff about consciousness at the time, but the kind of scientific truth of it is that our actions happen neurologically before our conscious thought to do them. There's this kind of very famous and controversial, though it's always been repeated, like the results are not controversial, but like what it means is controversial, in which a scientist, I think it was like during brain operations, because they had to they used to like cut open the entire head, and so they could see the entire brain, was testing the time it took between our decision to move our hand or move some body part, then the brain signal to move that body part. Right? Like, you can see consciousness light up in the brain. You can see where the thought lights up, and you can see, you can measure the difference in time between that and the signal to move. But what he found, and he really hated finding it, right? Like, because he believed very strongly in free will. He's religious. I mean, part of it was religious. And what he found was that the signal to move comes like a half of a second or something before the thought. And future studies have kind of like been different times, but it's always shown that the signal to move comes before the signal for thought. And so if you think about that, I mean, that puts a big kind of damper on the free will argument, but it also makes a sort of sense to me in that so much of our lives is kind of reacting to the context that we're given. Things that kind of aren't our choice. You know, maybe because I'm adoptee, I think about this all the time, right? That I'm living in this life and my reactions to this life would be totally different if I had a different life. You know, like it starts with the context, and the actions that you do within that context come far after that. And maybe your thoughts about that and how you explain that to yourself in terms of free will or in terms of choosing what you're able to do or in terms of your desire comes after that. And so Matt is somebody who maybe is like more distance between like what he wants to do and what he actually wants to do, right? Like what his body is doing, because it's reacting in a certain way and it has a desire that he's not kind of acknowledging consciously. Than normal people. He's more distance between those two things than normal people. But I don't think that it's so odd, actually, right? I do think it's a pretty kind of common feeling if we think like, why do people constantly fall in love with people they shouldn't fall in love with? That's conditional, right? It's conditioned into you. Often it's because of some thing that you came to believe about love without knowing that you believed about it in your parents, right? Or why do we eat cereal in the morning rather than toast, right? Sometimes we have a thought about that, and sometimes it's like a craving, right? We call a craving, or not even anything. It's just by rote. Those experiences happen all the time, and sometimes they're like small things you never think of, like the cereal, and sometimes they're like really large things, like being transported into a totally different country against your will. So I think that really kind of describes a reality that I've had to live in much more than the ability to like shape reality into what I want it to be. And so I was trying to capture that in the book, though Matt doesn't know how to make sense of all of that because of all of the things that he's told to believe about, right? Like having choice and because of his fears of making choices and the consequences that have happened in the past, which have, in his mind, all been really terrible. And so it's better to just like not do the things, you know?
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment?
Sure.
So for the second segment, I like to invite the guest to bring a topic of their own. It can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I guess, I was just going to say what I've been thinking about recently is maybe quite relevant. I mean, that's when I start thinking about something, I can only kind of talk about that thing anyway. So I've already talked about it in some ways. I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, and she was saying how much she hated The Vegetarian and the Tokarczuk book, which were both recommendations of mine. And she just hated kind of being trapped, right, in that first person. And she said something that I thought was interesting. She said what she's looking for from a book is comfort. And so when you brought that up, I thought, this is exactly what I'm thinking about already. But my immediate reaction was, well, I guess I don't really look for comfort, but I get comfort anyway. I don't read books that are generally very comforting, but there's a certain kind of comfort just from the experience of a good book to me. And so I'm thinking about, like, what is it that, if there's a kind of emotional state or something that you want somebody to feel from your writing, what is that? It's not comfort to me, so I don't know.
Well, that's interesting because, I think a lot about it with my own work. Primarily, I'm a photographer and I also am a writer. And working in different mediums has sort of led me to consider a lot, like, what is this medium good at? What is it not good at? What does it do? Mm-hmm. And part of that ends up being, what am I trying to do with this? And what I always keep coming back to is, for me at least, the way that I understand art is that art is a form of communication. And I always think about this in terms of the communication between the artist and the audience, between the art and the audience. And like there's a triangle, you know, and that there's something happening on every leg of that triangle: art, artist, and audience. Trying to think about what experience I'm trying to impart to the audience and why I want them to have that experience is something that I end up spending a lot of time on. And I'm always really interested to sort of hear what other artists think about that, like if they approach their own work that way, and if so, what that goal might be for them. And, you know, like for me, it's pretty consistent with whatever body of work I'm working on. My motivations, I end up usually realizing later, my motivations are pretty consistent every time, even though it might be coming out in a different way. What I'm aiming for is kind of similar no matter what. But then like some people might be trying to do something different with each new piece, you know, and I think that's interesting too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So what are you usually aiming for then?
For me, I'm trying to, you know, so much of my existence is, you know, in the break, we were talking a little bit about the distance between two people and not being able to really know what anybody else's experience is like. Yeah. And, you know, I've come to realize that all of my work is an attempt to give the audience access to my internal states, which for me, because I'm not doing fiction really, and I'm not, with my photography, I'm not really doing constructed images. You know, everything is very personal. So that can be very explicit. And you can do those things with fiction and construction as well. I just am not very good at it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's this thing that was running through my head while we were talking the first part, the entire time. I was just writing about this, that love is so different in a way from empathy, and that like empathy being about the self on some level, love is having to believe in and then value the negativity of the other. That's a phrase from this philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, who's German, and he has this whole book called The Agony of Eros, and it's a great book. It's very short, and I'm going to teach it in the fall. But one of the things he kind of keeps focusing on is how consumerism has turned love, you know, like a kind of cheap kind of love into a kind of possession, right? A possession of the other, you know, like if you think of porn or something, or, you know, commercial advertising, right? Where you see somebody attractive and you imagine yourself as that person, and then you want what that person has because then you will feel attractive, right? On some kind of weird subliminal level. And he really kind of argues for love as a kind of destruction or deconstruction of the self, in that you really have to you have to honor the otherness of the other, which we are so often, I think, trying, because we think like this is the way we can understand how other people matter, right? Like, how can I tell if the people who are starving in some country that I don't know of, right? Like, they don't matter to me unless so I should find some way to like think of how we're similar. But that is not really love in the way that it is conceived of outside of capitalism. Love would be more like trying to understand the other as the other, and not having to put yourself in there just in order to like value their experience.
It's interesting, you know, because I'm thinking a lot about, you know, maybe couples therapies that I've done with my wife, or, you know, since we were just talking about my work, and if my work is explicitly about creating a connection between myself and the audience, using the art as an intermediary, what strikes me about that is that in order to make a connection between two things, those two things have to be separate to start with. Yeah. And that I think that there is a conception of relationships, especially sort of in the American mind, of two things becoming one thing. Yeah. Merging the bank accounts. Yeah. Or, you know, just that, you know, merging lives, or that there is no longer a distinction between the two halves of a couple. Yeah. And, but it's interesting because there is, I can't remember the exact words, but there's that Khalil Gibran quote that everybody always reads at weddings about love not being making one thing out of two things, but being two things separate and together. I'm really mangling the quotation, but it's interesting because I think in a lot of cases, whether it's parenting or marriage or even friendships or even like just with your coworkers, there is sort of always this pressure to reduce the distance between two things, between two people, until there is no distance at all, until they're just congruent and overlapping. But that ends up being the source of a lot of tension and conflict, right? Because people end up losing themselves in that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that, and especially in the context of art making, I guess I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah.
Or to like expect the other person to do something that you would do, right? Like sometimes that would be where my wife and I would have arguments where we would think, at first we would just think like, well, I would have done this. So I don't like, and we'd have to, you have to kind of teach the other person that, right? Like you do things differently and you can't kind of put yourself in the position if you want to have a kind of relationship that way. I mean, I think you're right. Like a lot of, it's actually making me think. I was taught and teach, Plato's Symposium in the context of love and desire. And it's like a bunch of speeches about love. And the one that's most famous and most remembered is this speech about how people were originally like one spherical being. And then Zeus like chop them in half or something. And so now they're always searching for their other half, right? And sometimes people like, sometimes my students say like, oh, I know this story, but I actually never knew where it was from. And that story has become so famous that you're kind of looking for this thing that completes you. But actually in the symposium, it's like this weird midway point that's supposed to be seductive, right? It's given by this speech maker who ends up being, like a traitor. and eventually when you get to Socrates' speech, it's about love as a dialogue, right? As a talk between two people. And it's kind of in some ways like almost the opposite of that. And as Plato's kind of pushing it towards that, it's just funny, like how much it appeals to us, the idea of being one, being whole, and the feeling that, and I think this is a pretty common feeling, right? That you're kind of like missing a part of you, and that when you fall in love, that feels in some way like a completion, but it's not a completion because you're right, like incorporating the other, or you and the other are being incorporated into one, right? It's just this kind of like completion of love, right? Like that you are able to love in this way that completes you. No, I'm not sure where I was going with this, but I was thinking about like the distance between those two people, and how if you do collapse it, right, there's no one to love then, right? You're just one thing. And even when you think about like what you desire, if you get it, it's like the moment right after sex where you're like, okay, I think we're done now. Like you've been having a good time, but now you're done. Now you're done. The desire is gone. It's because you've gotten the thing that you desired, right? You have a craving for jjajangmyeon, and you get the jjajangmyeon, and you eat it, and then the craving is gone, right? The desire, that craving, comes from like not being in possession, right? That like relationship has to have a constant desire, continuous desire that lasts over many years sometimes. And if you're always trying to possess the other, like what you're doing is like destroying the thing that is keeping the relationship going.
Yeah. I think too a lot about like in the context of parenting it sort of happens in a sort of different direction, I feel like, but it's similar, I think, to the way that a lot of parents, especially, well, it's not exactly new parents exactly necessarily, but I'm not sure what the right adjective is to use, but there is a certain type of parent that will tend to see their children as, a piece of themselves instead of as sort of a separate entity, like a separate person with their own desires and priorities and things like that. And it seems to me that there's a similar thing there, like if you're not able to see your child as something separate from yourself, then, what does that necessarily mean about the way that you think about them and love them,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's definitely I think we're like invoking the okay boomer clause here. Right. I was raised that way too, right? Like if you have separate desires, they don't make sense, and you can't be wanting something, right, that you haven't been told to do. And even like on the level of, I've actually had to learn, I mean, basically by having a relationship and then with kids too, that in that kind of typical way, I had to kind of learn to stop trying to like solve the problem and just like comfort the person who's having the problem, because you're trying to think like, if I'm in this situation, I would do this, right? Like that's why I want to solve the problem. But actually usually people are kind of saying, can I get some love here? Right. There's this great quote that I like from Lacan where he says, all desire is a desire for love. It's in the book too, right? And there's the other thing, that love is giving what you don't have. And I think of those things a lot, and like how cryptic, but also like true they feel. You have to give something you don't have, in that when the kids are crying out, right? Like the kids are saying, love me, right? They're saying like, my friend was telling me the story once about how her kids like cried to have something for dinner. Maybe it was like spaghetti or something. And she was like, no, we're having this thing. We're having this other thing. I've already, like, this is the plan. And finally she was like, fine, I'll make this like spaghetti or whatever. And she gives them the spaghetti and they don't want to eat it. Right. And so she throws it all in the garbage. But of course, then they want to eat it, right? And they're all like upset. But the whole time, what they're asking for is like, will you do this thing for me? Will you show me that you love me? And I have to keep reminding myself of that all the time, because my kids, like they often what they want is like some kind of reaction. But the reaction really is like about love, but it's often like very annoying, like it's like what you're trying to do is like get a rise out of me and like make it seem as if like whatever you do is going to have this huge effect on my life. But it is going to have it. And I have to kind of remember to think all desire is a desire for love, and how true it is, especially for children.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's one of those things too. It's like especially if we're not used to considering, I think, in our culture, we're not necessarily encouraged by American culture to think of children as like complete people, with their own internal life. And so you tend to like, even when you read a lot of parenting books, your parenting books are most often writing about children as though they are a problem to be solved instead of a person, but then they just don't have the vocabulary or, sort of life experience to have a certain level of self-awareness to know what it is they're asking for. So then your job as the parent is to try to read between the lines a little bit. But then again, nobody really teaches you how to do that as a parent.
No, I think of that. I'm not trying to compare children to dogs, but that they used to have those dog trainers. They probably still have them, right? Like where that dog whisperer comes in and solves the problem that humans are having with the dogs. And my wife loved those shows, and she used to say, like what they always just train the human. Like they come in and they train the human, right? Like they're not training the dogs. The dogs are fine. They're just trying to train the human to be able to like not try to, right? Like just do exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes, that's a great question. I like that a lot. I'm lucky to have two books coming out on the same day as mine that I really love and hope people will take a look at and give love to. One is by Liz Lenz, and it's about motherhood and all of the things, cultural context around it. And the other one is called The Unreality of Memory by Lisa Gabbert, who is one of my favorite essayists for sure. She's just got this like really amazing collector's mind, and the essays are kind of, it seems as if she's just been collecting these pieces of information and ideas over a long period of time, and then has somehow found a way that they make sense together, maybe only in her head, which is, I think, is one of my favorite ways to write an essay.
Mm. It's always so surprising when you can find someone that can do things in unexpected ways like that. And it's such a delight.
Oh, and I just found out my thesis professor for my MFA, Margot Lizzie, has a book coming out the same day. I don't know how it slipped by, but I'm looking forward to that as well.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it. I had a great time.
Me too. Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Matthew has virtual book tour events coming up in August and September, and you can find links to those in the show notes. You can also check out his website to see the full schedule. You can buy a copy of Disappear, Doppelgänger Disappear at your local bookstore or at bookshop.org. And if you do love the book, leave it a 5-star review on Amazon or Goodreads. That is an easy and free way to help boost sales and support Matthew's work. Real quick, also, the book that Matthew mentioned at the end, the new one by Liz Lenz, that is called Belabored, A Vindication of the Rights of Pregnant Women. And by the time you're listening to this, it is available for purchase. Liz was my guest in episode 98, and I absolutely adore her work, so do get a copy of that one as well. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you're enjoying Keep the Channel Open, I would love it if you'd tell a friend or leave a review on Podchaser or Apple Podcasts, or drop me a line on Twitter or via email. You can find all of the show's contact and social media info, plus transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. If you're interested in listening to some excellent and diverse fiction, you can check out my other show, Likewise Fiction, where I read outstanding short stories by authors including Alvin Park, Celeste Ng, Ani Sison-Kuni, Chaya Bhuvaneshwar, and more. You can find that wherever podcasts can be found or at likewisefiction.com. Keep the Channel Open will be back on August 26th with a conversation with photographer Jessica Eaton, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.